The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise now has a total of 11 different games that create a deep and complex story, and within that story there are many mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. The franchise is known for having iconic mysteries that have remained unsolved for 10 years, and 3 of these unsolved mysteries stand out as some of the most complicated and prominent mysteries from the entire series. There are countless theories in all of these mysteries, and even I've tried to solve them multiple times, and in one of my last videos I combined solving 3 of the most popular mysteries from the franchise into one video, and in this video I'm going to combine 3 more of the most popular theories from the franchise, and I'm going to finally solve them definitively. So in this video I'm going to solve the Midnight Motors minigame, when Five Nights at Freddy's sister location takes place in the timeline, and finally what are the shadow animatronics. Starting with Midnight Motors, that has been in the franchise since Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator, it's one of the biggest mysteries from the series that still hasn't been answered, and we've even got references to it in Fnaf's newest spin-off game, 5 Laps at Freddy's, so it's obvious this mystery is still crucial to the franchise, so let's attempt to solve it.
The Midnight Motors minigame was in Five Nights at Freddy's 6, and the only way to access it was to purchase the Midnight Motors arcade. On lap 4 there's a secret entrance, and when you go through it the minigame begins, and this is also where the mystery begins. But before I dive into this theory, here's a quick recap of the minigame. It starts with the player controlling a purple car driving in the rain, with the first possible stop being in an area with a pile of dirt. You then stop at a place called Junior's where you're denied entrance, and from there you go back home where you're looking for someone in a rageful manner. You then pass someone watching TV and then knock on someone's door yelling for them to come out. When they ultimately don't listen, you go back outside and around the house only to find they have broken their window and escaped, leaving behind their footprints in the mud next to some mysterious footprints of an animatronic. The minigame then ends and you're left with a million questions. Now a lot of this minigame still remains a mystery, so in order to solve this mystery, let's start with what we do know. The first thing that is almost known as a fact now is that this minigame takes place after Henry's daughter, Charlie, is murdered. We know this because the name of the minigame is called Later That Night in the game files, and it's raining the same way it does in the FNAF 2 minigame where we see William Afton murder Charlie. Meaning something else that is agreed on in the community is the fact that the orange guy who we play as is also Purple Guy or William Afton. We know this for the following reasons, with the biggest one being that he's driving a similar purple car like the one in the FNAF 2 minigame. In the opening scene of FNAF 6, we also see a bear wearing a purple and orange suit, implying that these two are interchangeable. Also, looking at this from a logical standpoint, the whole idea of Purple Guy is that he's this shadowy figure and that's why he's purple. But when he's not in the shadow like in this minigame, it simply makes sense that he's not purple. And finally, Scott Cawthon most likely made him orange in order to confuse the fandom even more, and it worked, and for a while too. Introducing a new and random characters so far into the franchise was something none of us expected, but now we can confidently say this is William Afton. Moving on, something else we know for certain is that the footprints of the animatronics have to be real and were physically there. There are some theories that illusion discs were used to portray some animatronics, but if this were true, only the person who escaped could see the footprints and not William Afton, who we play as. If illusion discs were being used, that means the animatronics couldn't be seen from any other perspective, so again this means the footprints are real. And at some point an animatronic was there, but why? Unfortunately, when this takes place, who Orange Guy is and the footprints being real is all we know about this minigame for certain, which means more than half of the minigame still remains a mystery. And now this is really where the theory begins. Starting from the top, let's discuss the pile of dirt. Now there are a lot of theories on what's under the dirt, with the very popular but controversial one being that it was Funtime Freddy. And like the twisted animatronics from the books, when it was time, Funtime Freddy would get out and abduct the person who escaped. Now although I like this theory, I don't think it's the case here for many reasons I'll explain later on in this theory, but I think it's a lot more simple. I think the pile of dirt is a grave, and more specifically the grave of the crying child, the son of William Afton. Now it makes sense that his grave would be near their home, this way they could mourn the death of the crying child when they needed to, and it also explains another mystery of this minigame. If FNAF 6 was really meant to be the last game in the franchise, and if it was meant to answer any questions from previous games, why would Scott Cawthon make what's under the dirt complicated to the point where it needs books and other games to explain it? If this was the final chapter, it makes sense for it to be simple, like a grave. But moving on to the next stop and location, what is Junior's? Originally, many thought this was the FNAF 2 pizzeria, since it would be the junior location of the FNAF 1 pizzeria, meaning the green character telling William he can't enter was Henry, but I don't think this is true, and here's why. Instead, I think this is just a bar and William is being denied since he's been drinking too much. This would explain his rage and would support the fact that Henry was at the pizzeria when his daughter was murdered. It's fairly simple, and I don't think there's much to this location besides context. Moving on to the last location, which is the most confusing, the house. Now this is where everyone tends to disagree on what is happening, so here's my interpretation on what I think is correct. Starting with who's watching TV, most people say that this is Michael Afton. They say this is him because of his gray shirt, his gray text, and because of the fact he's watching TV, just like he does in FNAF's sister location. But I don't think that's true for many reasons, starting with the behavior. This person tells William Afton to leave him alone tonight, he had a rough day. And this is something that Michael Afton just wouldn't say, especially considering his behavior in Fnaf 4. He would scare the crying child at every moment he had, and obviously had no issue with making him cry. So stopping William Afton from going inside his room is definitely something he just wouldn't do. Now the grey text and shirt is something we do see on Michael in Fnaf 4, but it makes no sense that it's Michael in this situation. If William Afton has a different text and color, why would only Michael stay the same? Scott Cawthon wouldn't just pick and choose to change some things while keeping other things the same. If something about a character that we are used to is changed, then that has to be the case for all characters, including the person watching TV. Now, watching TV is something Michael does, but I think this is just here to confuse everyone even more, and this can easily be anyone watching TV. So with that said, if this isn't Michael, then who is this? Well, I think it's Miss Afton. She has the kind and calm behavior that any mother would, and it makes sense for her to defend the person in the room. The grey text and shirt work for a character, and again, watching TV is something everyone does. But finally, moving on to the last mystery character and the footprint, who's the person that escaped and why are there footprints of an animatronic? Now, most people seem to think that the crying child was the one who escaped, but here's why that can't be possible. Logically, I find it hard to believe that a child was able to break a window and escape somewhere without anyone noticing. And why would William Afton be looking for the crying child in a rageful way? If the crying child was already dead by this point, it supports the fact that William Afton would start drinking and become rageful, where he eventually murders Charlie and the other children. But if this isn't the crying child, then who is it? Well, I think it's Michael Afton, and here's why. First, it could be possible that someone Michael's age was able to break a window and escape, and he would be escaping to go to the crying child's grave. Think about it, in a game where Michael Afton is the main character, why would the minigame focus on someone else like the crying child? It makes sense that he's escaping to mourn his brother's death, and it also makes sense why William Afton wouldn't want him to. And it's simply because he's angry at him. Michael was responsible for his brother's death, and of course William Afton blames him. This would explain why his mom was defending him from William Afton, and it backs up the fact and every other detail of the minigame. But if this is Michael, then what are those footprints? Well, I think it's Fredbear, and here's why. If we know William Afton is angry at Michael and doesn't want him visiting the crying child's grave, then it makes sense for him to want to scare him away and make him feel guilty. And what better way to do that than placing Fredbear right outside his window? This way Michael feels all of the guilt by getting his little brother killed and wouldn't dare step foot outside. He would almost become terrified of Fredbear the same way the crying child was once before. But because it's raining, William Afton isn't able to place Fredbear outside, scared that it will damage the spring lock features. Hence why all we see are the footprints. And the reason there aren't any other footprints is most likely because he took it back through the bushes, so we aren't able to see them. We also know that Michael isn't abducted by anything because we see his footprints continue on, meaning he successfully escaped. But with all that said, here's a quick recap of my theory and how I solved this mystery. The minigame begins with William Afton drunk, driving back to his home after murdering Henry's daughter, Charlie. He then makes his first stop to visit his son's grave, where he mourns over the death of the crying child. He then drives to the nearest bar called Junior's, where he is denied entry as it is clear how much he's been drinking. Now, even more enraged, he returns home to find his wife on the couch mindlessly watching TV. Looking for someone to let go of his rage on, he heads for Michael's room, before his wife tells him to stop and to leave him alone. He doesn't listen and heads to his room, only to find that his door is locked and he won't open it. William goes outside, back around the house to his room, only to find that Michael has escaped by breaking through the window to visit his brother's grave, only leaving behind his footprints next to the footprints of the Fredbear animatronic William had left there to scare Michael. And with all of that, the minigame ends once more.
Moving on to Five Nights at Freddy's sister location and when it takes place in the timeline, let's look at one of the more complicated mysteries from the franchise. As what makes it so complicated is how different sister location feels from the rest of the franchise, and because this game is crucial to how the story of Fnaf developed. It's hard to place it somewhere in the timeline, so let's attempt to answer when sister location takes place in the franchise. Now, the biggest issue in trying to solve when this game takes place in the timeline is how different sister location is compared to the other Fnaf games. Fnaf 1 through 4 were all grounded games and stories while being easy to follow and being easy to place in a timeline. But Sister Location isn't that easy to follow since it introduces new ideas like Remnant, which is the cause for the animatronics being possessed, and the idea of extracting Remnant. Remnant is the term for soul energy, which can take the form of a metallic substance which can bind souls to inanimate objects. So the remnant of the 5 children murdered bind it together with the animatronics, giving them life, and this process actually happens a lot throughout the franchise. Many fans label this game as the first sci-fi Fnaf game, and it makes sense when considering what exactly happens. Not only do we learn how the remnant from the murdered children mesh together with the metal of the animatronics, but we also learn how Remnant is able to actually keep someone alive. After Michael Afton has his insides removed by a scooping machine, Ennard climbs inside his body and uses his body as a suit to escape the sister location bunker. But eventually Michael throws Ennard up out of his body and somehow he is able to survive. Many fans theorize this strange event was because of Remnant, and even Michael himself points out this strange phenomenon.
But something is wrong with me. I should be dead, but I'm not.
So again, Fnaf's sister location is drastically different to the other games, making it hard to place in the timeline. But what fans have agreed on is that this game can take place in either one of two spots in the story, and placing what games happened before and after sister location is also fairly simple. We know the timeline starts with Fnaf 4, then Fnaf 2 and 1 follow, and after a 30-year time jump, Fnaf 3 follows, and finally Fnaf 6 concludes the main timeline. And after that point, the newest Fnaf games have been released in chronological order story-wise. But for now, I only want to focus on Fnaf 4 to Fnaf 3, as it's believed that Fnaf's sister location either takes place before Fnaf 2 and 1 or it takes place after. So let's look at all the pieces of evidence from both sides of the argument, starting with those who believe that this game takes place before Fnaf 2 and 1, with the main piece of evidence relying on the fact that Michael was a rotting corpse by the end of sister location. In the Fnaf 1 ending and in the Fnaf 2 Night 7 ending, we see two people get fired for the exact same reasons. We see Mike Schmidt and Fritz Smith get fired for tampering with the animatronics and for odor. Because the names are very similar, it's assumed that this is actually one person being fired from both of these locations for the same reasons, and that person would be none other than Michael Lafson, who is using a fake name, and we even see him keep Mike in the Fnaf 1 ending. It's also assumed that Michael was tampering with the animatronics to learn about them and to learn why they were ever possessed. But what about the odor? Well, what if the odor came from his decaying body, since if sister location did take place before these games, he would have already been a walking corpse. But another big piece of evidence comes from Michael's speech from the end of sister location.
Father, it's me, Michael. I did it. I found it. It was right where you said it would be. They were all there. They didn't recognize me at first, but then they thought I was you. And I found her. I put her back together, just like you asked me to. She's free now. But something is wrong with me. I should be dead, but I'm not. I've been living in shadows. There is only one thing left for me to do now. I'm going to come find you. I'm going to come find you.
From this speech, we learn that Michael's trying to find his father William, and where else would he go looking for him besides all the locations he owned? Which would explain why he even worked at those two restaurants as a security guard, and it's even more evidence that sister location takes place before Fnaf 2 and 1. But moving on to the other side of the argument, which is that sister location takes place after these games, the evidence is very similar. When looking at the same speech, at the very end of it, we see Springtrap emerge from the shadows, and in the back we even see a sign advertising Fazbear's Fright, conveying that the events that happen in that location, or the events of Fnaf 3, happen right after sister location, which also puts this game right after the first Fnaf game. And to me, this is actually enough evidence to make a definitive decision, being that sister location has to take place after Fnaf 2 and 1 and before Fnaf 3. If sister location did take place before Fnaf 2, then why show Fazbear's Fright in the ending of sister location, which is clearly showing that Fnaf 3 is next? They're not showing a sign for the grand reopening of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which would have been setting up Fnaf 2, so again, they're obviously setting up Fnaf 3. Not to mention, we also see Springtrap, who's the main antagonist in Fnaf 3, and again, it's clearly hinting that Springtrap is what took place next. These are important details that almost feel dismissed by saying that sister location takes place before Fnaf 2, and the line, "I'm going to come find you," fits more with this idea, as instead of Michael looking for his dad in his restaurants, he's directly finding him in Fazbear's Fright. Now, the main piece of evidence that supports this game happens before Fnaf 2, which is the order that caused Michael to be fired, would work except for one minor detail, which is context. I think we can assume when Scott Cawthon created those endings, he wasn't planning that they would correlate to Michael being scooped 3 games down in the franchise. If anything, I think it was supposed to be a fun detail for fans to notice, and not anything that would tell us that Michael had already been scooped, which is why I also think we shouldn't be using this as one of the main pieces of evidence. And besides these endings and the speech from sister location that is actually supporting Fnaf 3 takes place afterwards, there isn't much evidence supporting it takes place before FNAF 2. Most of the evidence is about the story and how everything would place narrative-wise, and narratively it would work better if Sister Location did take place before FNAF 2. But when we're looking at just the evidence and what we know to be facts, Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location has to take place after the first FNAF game and before FNAF 3. But this is just a theory. Moving on, let's finally answer a mystery that has spanned across the 10 years the franchise has been around, the Shadow Animatronics. These animatronics have appeared in many games now, and the key to solving them might lie in a whole different FNAF project. So let's finally answer who Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are in the FNAF franchise. First, let's go over the history of Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie. Shadow Bonnie first appeared in FNAF 2 in the security guard's office, but would have no real effect on the gameplay if you wore the Freddy mask on time, but there was actually a chance that your game would crash. It's the same model as Toy Bonnie, just blacked out with white eyes and teeth. Shadow Freddy also appears in FNAF 2, but appears in the back with the withered animatronics and again never affects the player. It's the same model as Golden Freddy, but again it's blacked out with hints of purple and again white eyes and teeth. Both animatronics appear again in FNAF 3, both again in the security guard's office. Shadow Freddy appears in the farthest left corner in the screen and will only be visible for a couple of seconds before disappearing. Toy Bonnie appears on the desk as a minifigure, and when he's clicked on, it unlocks a secret minigame where you control Shadow Bonnie, and it's a part of the process to get the good ending. We then see Shadow Freddy again in all of the minigames at the end of every night. He leads the main animatronics to a storage room where Willie Mafton dismantles them. Moving on, many believe that we actually see Shadow Freddy again in FNAF 4 in the form of Nightmare. Nightmare is the exact same model as Nightmare Fredbear, which we know is supposed to be Golden Freddy, meaning if this is Shadow Freddy, it would match up with what we know about their models. Then we see Shadow Bonnie in Ultimate Custom Night as a bonus animatronic, and finally we see him one last time in FNAF AR as a main part of the gameplay. These animatronics have actually shown up plenty of times throughout the franchise, and although it may seem like they were just randomly placed throughout the series, I think they are actually significant to the overall lore and story, and here's why. Well, all of the main theories around the Shadow animatronics revolve around one idea and one thing, which is Remnant. Remnant is mentioned a couple of times in FNAF Sister Location, FNAF 6, FNAF AR, and of course in the books. Remnant is the term for soul energy, which can take the form of a metallic substance which can bind souls to inanimate objects. So the remnant of the 5 children murdered bind it together with the animatronics, giving them life, and this process happens a lot throughout the franchise. So if all of these theories believe that these animatronics are just pure remnant, where did all of this remnant come from? Well, there's two main ideas. One idea is that the remnant comes from Springlock victims that were employees wearing the suits when the Springlocks went off. In FNAF 3's Night 4 phone call, we actually learn about various Springlock incidents.
There's been a slight change of company policy concerning use of the suit. Don't. After learning of an unfortunate incident at the sister location involving multiple and simultaneous spring lock failures, the company has deemed the suit temporarily unfit for employees. Safety is top priority at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which is why the classic suits are being retired to an appropriate location while being looked at by our technicians.
So it could be very possible that the remnant from these incidents created the Shadow animatronics, and this actually would make a lot of sense except for one minor detail. Toy Bonnie, or the model for Shadow Bonnie, isn't a Springlock animatronic, only Golden Freddy is, so this theory would make a lot more sense if Shadow Bonnie used the Springtrap model for its design, since the original Springtrap animatronic, Spring Bonnie, did obviously have Springlocks. So for this reason, I don't completely believe in this theory, but this next idea does make even more sense and has all of the evidence supporting it. With this idea, the remnant that comes from the Shadow animatronics comes from the Bite victims. One happened in 1983 and the other in 1987. The Bite of 83 was an incident between Fredbear and the crying child resulting in his death. The Bite of 87 was an incident between a security guard and an unknown animatronic, resulting in the security guard losing their frontal lobe but surviving. This is actually one of the biggest mysteries from the entire franchise, with some of the suspects including Mangle, Foxy, Toy Chica, and of course Toy Bonnie. Since we already know Golden Freddy caused the Bite of 83, it would make a lot of sense if Toy Bonnie was responsible for the Bite of 87, creating Shadow Bonnie. Not only does this theory answer who the Shadow animatronics are, but it also answers one of the biggest FNAF mysteries of all time. But there's one big flaw with all these theories. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie aren't exactly the same like many people assume. Sure, they appear in the same games and both are playable characters in the FNAF 3 minigames, but they have slight differences in designs that matter a lot, and the minigames they're in are very different. When looking at their designs, Shadow Bonnie is just a silhouette silhouette of Toy Bonnie with white pupils, but Shadow Freddy has hints of purple in his design and looks like he's physically there. He isn't just a silhouette of Golden Freddy, he's actually there. And when comparing both minigames they're in, Shadow Freddy moves around the pizzeria and leads the animatronics to William. It's a very grounded and simple objective. But with Shadow Bonnie, it's obvious that this minigame doesn't take place within the real world, as we see things like a giant crying puppet and we even see the crying child spirit. Like I previously mentioned, Shadow Bonnie appears in Fnaf AR as his own segment when you collect too much Dark Remnant and you have to flash your light to stop him. This flat out confirms that Remnant has everything to do with Shadow Bonnie, but why not include Shadow Freddy? I think that this was done for a very specific reason to tell us that he's not made from Remnant. Well, I think that because Shadow Freddy has an almost realistic design, his minigame takes place within the real world, and because he doesn't appear in Fnaf AR with relation to Remnant, I think that he's a real animatronic that existed at some point in the franchise. In Fnaf 4, Nightmare, or also known as Shadow Freddy in the game files, is actually a physical animatronic, as we learn from the Tales from the Pizzaplex novel that all animatronics from Fnaf 4 are just animatronic mannequins, and gas that fills the room is what makes whoever's in there hallucinate the nightmare animatronics. But the final piece of evidence on top of everything I've already discussed comes from the Fnaf movie. Now, it's obvious that the movie and games have their own story and are separate continuities, but the one thing that stays the exact same are the animatronics, not only in their design but even with their function, as we see with the Spring Bonnie suit. And in the movie we see Shadow Freddy as a physical animatronic where Max's body is stuffed inside. The movie could have used any animatronic for this moment, but they specifically chose Shadow Freddy, and I think this means something. I think this is Scott Cawthon's way of saying that Shadow Freddy is a real animatronic within the franchise. But why was a purple version of Golden Freddy even created? Well, this could be for really any reason, but I think it was a test animatronic where William used to create the spring locks. And the reason it's possessed and able to move freely is because of a spring lock failure involving an employee, like a previous theory I mentioned believes in. This explains why it's in the storage room in Fnaf 2, and explains why it helps William lure the animatronics to be dismantled, as it's an employee helping his boss. And in Fnaf 3, Shadow Freddy acts like an illusion, just like any of the other animatronics, as we know whoever we play as must have seen Shadow Freddy at least once in the Fnaf 2 location. But in the sense of Shadow Bonnie, I think all the theories around him are correct. He's the Remnant version of Toy Bonnie. And personally, I lean towards the theory that the Remnant comes from the Bite victim from the Bite of 87, as this would answer two of the biggest theories from the franchise, and it makes a lot of sense narratively. So with all of that said, Shadow Freddy is a real animatronic that appears as an Easter egg in Fnaf 2 and 3, while Shadow Bonnie was created by Remnant that came from the Bite victim of the Bite of 87. So with all of that said, in Midnight Motorist we play as William Afton, who has a new appearance as Orange Guy. The person on the couch watching TV is Miss Afton and not Michael Afton. Instead, Michael Afton is the person who William Afton is angry with, and he's the person who runs away from their home. And with sister location, Five Nights at Freddy's sister location has to take place after the first FNAF game and before FNAF 3. We know this because of evidence from the first two FNAF games, crucial evidence from sister location, and even more evidence from FNAF 3. And finally, Shadow Freddy is a real animatronic that appears in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 and 3, while Shadow Bonnie was created by Remnant that came from the Bite victim from the Bite of 87 and is an illusion, making these two shadow animatronics completely different. And with that said, these are three answers to three of the biggest mysteries from the entire FNAF franchise. I hope you guys enjoyed this video where I covered 3 different mysteries from the FNAF franchise and attempted to solve them. Remember, this is just a theory, and by no means was I able to solve any of these mysteries without the help of the community. But what do you guys think? Who are the characters we see in Midnight Motorist? When does FNAF's sister location take place in the timeline? And what are the shadow animatronics? So make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you guys so much for watching.